Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural Naveed Arif Iqbal closing keynote lecture. This keynote lecture is named in memory of Arif Iqbal's son, Naveed. And while Arif can't be here today in person, he was able to share a moving video message, which we will watch now as a prelude to the keynote address.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests, faculty, students, and every passionate advocate for mental health present today. As we gather here at the onset of the cherry blossom season in Japan, we're reminded of the fleeting beauty of life. Late March in Japan welcomes the stunning yet brief display of cherry blossoms, inviting us all to pause, reflect, and celebrate their short-lived splendor. This natural cycle of renewal and beauty, poignant in its brevity, mirrors the essence of our gathering today. It calls us to cherish each moment, to support one another in our most vulnerable times, and to work together towards a future where the beauty of life is accessible to all, untouched by the shadow of depression. Understanding my son, Naveed, was a journey I hadn't completed, revealing parts only in his absence. His hesitance to speak of himself meant that many facets of his kindness came to light only through the stories others shared after he was gone. The depth of his compassion was revealed to me in ways I had never known, through anecdotes of selflessness and empathy. Stories like how he spent a whole day helping a friend and his entire fan club of cats move to a new apartment. Naveed never stopped sneezing the whole day since he was allergic to cats, but continued to help with the move. I did not know how, upon hearing that his friend was having a rough time, Naveed packed his car, picked up his friend, and drove to Chicago, driving in the middle of winter. I did not know the stories about how in his last few weeks, he wrote more than 50 letters to his tennis students and close friends, individually encouraging them and thanking them for the moments they shared, and even tried to meet them personally. And I only heard the story from another father who had also lost his son to depression, that Naveed on his very last day donated a big part of his graduate school savings to their fund to create a safe space for young adults going through mental health challenges. These acts, shared posthumously, painted a portrait of a life rich in quiet generosity and profound empathy. Reflecting on Naveed's journey, it becomes clear that his legacy is defined not by his silence on his struggles, but by the loudness of his love and kindness, and forms the cornerstone of the Naveed Arif Iqbal keynote address. As these stories unfold, revealing the breadth of Naveed's compassion, they also cast a light on a profound truth that remained hidden from our eyes: the silent battles he fought within himself. Despite the joy he brought to others, Naveed carried within him a weight we could not see, a torment that words alone failed to capture. I did not fully grasp the torment Naveed endured. I could not hear what the voices inside his head were telling him. I could not tell how long they were continuing to haunt him and how he was suffering. I did not know what it meant for him to ask for help and how. We live in our own minds, in our own reality, in our own truth, but that is not a universal truth. In my heart, I've come to understand our perceptions of reality. Our truths are deeply personal experiences shaped by the conversations we have with ourselves. Yet for Naveed and for many others like him, these internal dialogues are not mere reflections, but battles waged in the quiet. And this realization brings us to a pivotal question. How can we, that is those on the outside, create and allow the environment for this vulnerable conversation about mental health to take place? How can we support with empathy and compassion to let those suffering from depression know that they are not alone? We are there for them unconditionally. My hope in establishing this award is not only to honor what was important to Naveed, but also to find new ways of supporting others who feel devoid of hope. I feel truly blessed to partner with the wonderful staff of the University of Michigan Depression Center: Taylor, Lizelle, Stephanie, Michelle, Beth, and Nancy, who devote themselves to helping others. Having Dr. O as being the keynote speaker for the inaugural address was a privilege. His personality, approach, and inclusivity resonate deeply with the spirit and intention of Naveed's life. As we reflect on the conversations we're about to have and the insights we're poised to gain from Dr. O's keynote, I want to leave you with a thought that resonates deeply with the reason we're all here today. It's a sentiment expressed by the actor Keanu Reeves when asked about life's most profound mystery: what happens after we die? His response was simple, yet it carries the weight of profound truth. I know the ones who love us will miss us. In the context of our gathering, this statement goes beyond its surface meaning. It's a reminder of the profound impact each life holds and the indelible mark we leave on those who love us. It's a call to action for us all to recognize the urgency and the necessity of reaching out, of providing support, and of fostering environments on our campuses where mental health is prioritized and every student feels valued and supported. Let's carry this message forward, not just today, but in all our endeavors. Let's ensure that our actions and interventions echo in the lives of those we aim to support, so that in our community, no one so overwhelmed by darkness feels unseen. Remember, the love we show, the support we provide, and the understanding we extend can be the light that guides someone out of their darkest moments. So as we move forward, let us all commit to being a part of that light for each other, in honor of those we've lost, in support of those who struggle, and as a beacon of hope for a future free from the burden of depression. Thank you for being here, for allowing me to honor Naveed's memory, and for dedicating yourselves to this vital cause.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Eisenberg Depression Center, I want to thank Arif for honoring his son's memory in such a thoughtful and impactful way. Students like Naveed are why many of us are here today. And it is my honor to introduce the first ever Naveed Arif Iqbal Keynote lecturer, Dr. Fermi Okanlami, the Director of Student Accessibility and Accommodation Services, or SAS, at the University of Michigan, and also a physician and faculty member at Michigan Medicine. Affectionately known to many as Dr. O, he is a nationally recognized leader in disability advocacy and has been featured on CBS News, the PBS NewsHour, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and Good Morning America. And he's the recipient of numerous accolades, including Michigan Medicine's Distinguished Early Career Alumni Award, and serves on a number of boards, including the Omega Alpha Medical Honor Society Board of Directors. And in 2023, last year, he was appointed by President Biden to serve on the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition. As I've shared earlier today, so much of what we think about and discuss during this conference, while difficult, is grounded in a sense of hope, a desire for change and improvement, and a moral imperative for action, even when the answers are not easy or obvious. I can't think of a better closing keynote lecturer to bring all of these themes together. We will start with a presentation by Dr. O and then follow with a fireside chat discussion together and with all of you here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Okanlami to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Mortensen. Good afternoon, everyone. I always do a very quick introduction. I am Fermi Okanlami. I use he, him pronouns. Many people call me Dr. O. I'm a middle-aged black man with brown skin, short black hair. I'm wearing glasses, a wooden bow tie, a plaid shirt, and a vest, and I'm seated in a manual frame wheelchair. Now, I didn't give you a visual description so that you get a sense of my fashion. But I did it because what we don't often recognize is that individuals that are blind or low vision, that don't have the opportunity to see who you are or see your slides, miss a critical component of presentations and don't always feel involved. Now, I like to tell stories, and so I will likely make the next 20 minutes or so a series of stories before Dr. Mortensen and I come and chat together. And the first story I'll tell you is this. About a year or so ago, I gave a keynote at the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and after the presentation, someone came up to me and he was in tears. So much so that he had to wait a few moments before he could actually ask his question, and when he did, he said, "I moved to this country because I want to become a physician." Where I'm from, they don't believe that individuals that are blind can be doctors. But I've been to countless academic presentations, and I have never felt seen the way I did today as you described yourself and you described your slides. Now, this other story is one that happened locally. There's a colleague of mine here at the University of Michigan. There's no secret, and if he's here or if he hears, he knows that I use this story. But he and I had a series of somewhat contentious back and forth discussions about this practice of visual descriptions. He thinks that it's actually a damaging practice that wastes time and is not necessary. Now, I think it's important for you to know that this individual himself is blind. And we had such a back and forth that he ended up writing an article called Putting a Closing to Disclosing the Clothing. Now, why did I tell you these two seemingly conflicting stories? I said it because when you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. So I don't claim to sit here in front of you as the ambassador for all disability to say that what you hear today is exactly what you should do for every disabled person you see moving forward. But what I hope is that it engages us in a conversation about access. It engages us in a conversation to say our goal should be providing people with what they need to have access, recognizing that the disability community is very diverse in and of itself. And so there's no one-size-fits-all solution to how we address some of these items. So Dr. Mortensen knows this, and the core organizers of this conference know this. I don't prepare for any of my presentations far in advance. Because I think that if I come into a presentation thinking I already know what you need to hear, and that is what I do alone, I am doing a disservice to you. So what I often do, and I will ask maybe one or two souls that would like to then share, I want to know why you are here today. I want to know what it is that you either expected to hear or what it is that you want to hear. Because just like, in my life as a surgeon, I wouldn't go into the operating room not knowing what leg I planned on operating on. The patient should know what it is that we hope to do from that before we go in. And as an educator, you don't teach a course without letting the students know what the subject matter should be. And so there's a give and take here, and while I'm the one that's on the stage, the learning should not be unidirectional. And there are things that each and every one of us can learn from each other. And so therefore, I want to make sure that this is relevant to you. So you don't have to come to the microphone. I'll repeat it if people can't hear you. But one or two people that are willing to say why they came today and what it is that they either expected to hear or what it is that they wanted to hear. Now I say if there are no expectations, then my presentation better be a 10 out of 10, because if no one even expects anything of me, I can only exceed your expectations. So even just one person. Oh, all the way back there. And I'll repeat if people can't hear you. Is that Chloe? I just met this individual. So Chloe is a second-year MBA student. We literally had a Zoom call this morning. So please share with the team. I never met her in real life. This is not a plant, I promise you. So
confidence to kind of, thank you, to get more confidence to follow what feels right rather than follow the crowd. And for me right now, what feels right is helping people and maybe not either go to a consulting firm or go to tech, which is what 90% of the MBA's people do. So I'm listening. Thank you.
No, thank you, Chloe. So I'll just jump in then so we have enough time for the Q&A part. But here is my title slide. I call it Disabusing Disability, demonstrating that disability doesn't mean inability. Now, Dr. Mortensen said some of my roles here, and so I will not repeat those, but I'll jump right in with how I usually start my presentations. And I talk about the difference between equity and equality. Now, this next slide, I guarantee you, some of you have seen used before. So you don't have to speak, but show of hands, who has seen this slide before in some way? Almost everyone. Now here's an image that has two halves. On the two halves, there are three people. I call them tall, medium, and short. On each side, they're trying to watch what appears to be a baseball game on the other side of the fence. On one side, each of them is standing on one box, such that tall can see the game, medium can see the game, but short cannot see over or through the fence and see the game. On that side, it says the word equality. Now on the other side, same three individuals, but now the boxes have been moved such that tall is no longer on a box, medium is still standing on one box, but now short is standing on two boxes and can now see the game. Under that side, it says the word equity. Now, most people have seen this used in DEI presentations, in leadership presentations, trying to demonstrate that equity and equality are not the same thing. It is trying to say that equity is giving people what they need to have access, whereas equality is giving everyone the same thing regardless of need. Now, I use this slide because it's very easy to have a conversation about cartoon characters and boxes, when these are the conversations we're having at our homes and our institutions and our organizations about how we then allocate resources. Those boxes I use to say are resources. And how do we then distribute the resources within the organizations, the communities, the institutions at which we work? And I start with this one because the reality of our world is really more like this. On this one, it now has a third portion of that image, same three people, but now tall is standing on multiple boxes well above the field, and short is now standing in a box-sized hole and cannot see the game. What happens oftentimes when we show these slides is that people start to say, well, why did tall have to give up their box for short? Now, no one ever said who the boxes belonged to, but it gives us a vision into the way people think when they assign ownership to one of those boxes and say that that tall person may have worked very hard for that box. And is it their responsibility to give up their box that they worked hard for, not knowing what that short individual did to dig themselves into a box-sized hole? Now, I use this as a way to enter the conversation because too often we think that we're starting at the same place in our discussions. We think that everyone wants people to be able to see the game and that we're having discussions about how to then achieve that. But I will tell you that after I use this image for many, many, many times, are we switching something up? Sorry, everybody. Boom. Thank you. We look at this and assume that everyone wants the same thing. But when I use this image, after several months, someone put a comment in one of the posts where these slides were put up. And they said, why don't those insert racial slur here, buy tickets like everyone else and watch the game from the inside? Now, I did that not to be controversial or jarring, but I did it because what we don't often recognize is that when we are having discussions about what we are trying to do to achieve equity, some people think that that is giving someone something that they don't deserve in the first place. Now, this isn't to say that that is the audience we have, but I recognize that as we are making decisions and as we're allocating resources, the resources don't always tend to go in a place where we think they're most needed, but that's because not everyone thinks that they're needed there. Why did I open up this presentation with these same slides? Depression is something that people don't understand well. The impact that depression can have on one's life may lead to them having access needs that are different than other people. But that does not make that individual any less capable or competent or qualified. And so I have the fortune in one of my roles to be the individual that then leads a unit that provides that equitable access for students with all types of disability. You may have benefited from the presentation of one of my staff, Kat Nick, who's in the audience right now, and Jackie Heyman was part of that as well. Of course, I've got to give my team a shout out. But that is the work that we are blessed to be able to do because people still don't recognize that disability does not mean inability. There's an assumption that by acknowledging or disclosing disability, that is a weakness. And the medical model of disability is the way that most people have practiced. A model that sees disability as pathology alone, as a deficit, as something that needs to be fixed or rectified. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about my own story, just to give some context. And I tell people it was when I started living life from the other side of the stethoscope. So here's a collage that just gives a little brief snapshot of my life. On one image, I'm jumping through the air as a Stanford student athlete. My next image is there, me graduating right actually out there from Hill Auditorium after graduating from medical school here. And then the next image is of my family, my 2 physician parents, my grandparents with both having terminal doctorate degrees, my sister who's a lawyer. I say this not to pat myself on the back, but because education was something that my family said could never be taken from you. And so at that point, after I graduated from medical school, I thought that I was well on my way to being able to use my mind or my hands to affect change in people's lives as a physician, like I had seen my parents do for so long. But then this happened. During my 3rd year of orthopedic surgery residency, I dove into a pool and I broke my neck, becoming paralyzed from my chest down with very minimal use of my upper extremities. And this image is of me with my cervical collar on after my first surgery. And at this point, I started to realize just how little I knew about disability. Despite having 2 physician parents that took care of critically ill or injured children from premature babies all the way to age 18, I heard about medicine being discussed in my house all of the time. I volunteered at the hospital. At this point, I was a 3rd-year orthopedic surgery resident who took care of patients with disabilities. Yet I recognized at that point that I didn't even know how they got to the office that day. I didn't know how they put their shoes on, how they brushed their teeth. Yet they were coming to me with some expectation that me as physician would know more about what access needs they had. Now I do this because I recognize that disability is something that is still stigmatized in this world. And if even the medical profession that sees disability every day does not have the capacity to recognize the culture and identity component of disability, that doesn't have the capacity to discuss the access that we provide, that is how I try to frame these conversations. So with this slide, I try to bring it back together to talk about what the purpose of this discussion is that this image now shows a more diverse set of individuals and the fact that people's access needs may be different. So it has the same theme of 3 individuals trying to watch the game on the other side of a fence, but a box is not what everyone may need to have access. It may be a ramp that someone needs to have that access. But I also use this image to describe much more. Because when I first described the image to you, I did not tell you that the people were people of color. I just said tall, medium, and short. But oftentimes conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion make people think we're talking about 1 or maybe 2 things alone, race or gender. And we miss all of the individuals that are included in that diversity discussion. So this image shows people with different hairstyles, different skin tones, different clothing styles, different mobility aids. And then it wasn't until I used this for many, many years that I noticed the rainbow in the top corner, which I think then represents LGBTQ population as well. So when we are talking about what people need to have access, we need to see the diversity of the human experience. We need to not look at this as pathology, not look at it as a deficit, but recognize that every single one of us is on some sort of continuum, that if we look at this medical model alone, that is going to skew what we view as disabled or not. And so I want people to know that that access piece is how we can address this. Because I would love to destigmatize disability eventually. But I think until we can get there, being able to discuss how we can provide equitable access to everyone and allowing people to demonstrate what it is that they can do rather than judging or limiting them based on what they cannot. So here's an image of me in a standing frame wheelchair on 2 images. It was one of the things that gave me access to return to medicine. Now, I thought that this chair was the reason that I was able to get back to practicing medicine. And I'll tell you that someone who we actually lost just last year at this time, Judy Heumann, I let Judy see some of the images in a movie that was being made about me at that point. Judy Heumann, for those of you that don't know, is to the disability civil rights movement what I say that Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were for Black civil rights. Judy Heumann created a lot of the sort of the legislative policies that now provide us access such as the ADA. And she passed away last year, but I had the fortune of getting to know her before that. And after she watched this movie trailer, she said, you know what, Dr. O, if I didn't know you before this, I don't know that I would have wanted to. And I was like, whoa, Judy, I thought we were friends. Why would you say that? And she said, well, look at this video. It's all about huffing and puffing and walking and regaining function. I was like, yeah, it's pretty inspirational, right? She said, you have an opportunity and a platform now. What message are you delivering if you then say that the reason you now have the right to be in this space is because you're closer to your able-bodied self? While you may think that that standing frame chair is what has given you access, what you were saying to people is that you did not deserve the access when you were seated. What does that say to those people that never regained the ability to stand or walk? What does that say to people that can't afford something like a standing frame wheelchair? What does that say to those individuals that never had the ability to stand or walk? What we need to do is recognize that we can provide access regardless of what the people are coming to us with. That while that standing frame chair should not be seen as a negative thing because it did give me access to certain things, I should equally be advocating for the fact that people should have access even if they are seated. Now, I tell my story through the lens of my physical disability, but not because that is the most important thing. But it is my lived experience that I share, and had it not been for the video that we saw before, I did not anticipate telling you this story. But I then started to live life from the other side of the stethoscope, as I said, after my injury. And I started to see the world very differently. I've had 2 physician parents my entire life, and I felt as though they had given me an insight into this world of medicine. But what I don't often talk about, which I think is relevant right now to this conversation, is that about a week ago, 9 years ago, on March 2nd, I lost my physician father to suicide. We had no idea that he was struggling himself. He was the eldest of 6 brothers on his side, the eldest of 6 siblings on my mother's side, the one that was taking care of everyone. And just like he mentioned about his son, I didn't even know all of the different stories about the things that my father did until his funeral. And the warmth with which he took care of his patients and the community was something that you would have never known the depths of the struggle that he had. And despite having already gone through medical school and residency at that point, it made depression so much more real to me. That this isn't something that people choose. This isn't something that people just need to be strong and get out of it. It is something that many, many people experience. And the way that the stigma in our world still exists around it, we struggle to provide the appropriate access for people to be able to continue to live a fulfilled life, even if they still have depression. So I still have a spinal cord injury, but it doesn't mean that with the appropriate access, I'm not able to then demonstrate my ability to be successful. And so as we talk about depression on college campuses, what is it that we can do to make sure that we are not trying to tell our students that perfection is the expectation? That we recognize the lived experience of everyone, that whether you have an official diagnosis of a disability or whether you do not, that we can build in structures that recognize the complexity of the human experience, that we can make sure that students know that struggle is not a problem, but it is something that is inevitable, and we will provide the appropriate frameworks to be able to support individuals if and when that happens in their lives. That is something that I think that this conference brings together. It is something that I know, preaching to the choir, all of you already believe. And I know we've got different sort of practitioners in the audience, and that's why, as I wrap up here, it's something that Dr. Mortensen and I wanted to be able to do, is have a brief discussion about the way that this manifests in our lives. Some of the thoughts we have about what we can do to then improve the culture and climate around providing access for students with depression and other mental health illnesses on college campuses, and to attack it from not just a clinical lens, but from a lens of a community. Before I finish, I'll add these very two quick stories and then we'll have Dr. Mortensen come up. So this is an image that has a set of stairs and a sign that says stop pass holders and appointments only. And I'll make this story very brief. I was asked to then visit some of my friends in their house a little bit ago, and prior to going into their home, they made us get a COVID test. And so this is where they asked us to get the COVID test. So for me, as you may be able to imagine, I couldn't enter that building, but luckily there was someone else going to get their COVID test as well, and they went inside and told them that there was a gentleman waiting outside to get their COVID test. Now, the whole purpose of going to visit our friend's house was to then talk about how certain policies had impacted our community. And so we went into the building and ended up having a conversation, and this is an image of a long table, and I'm the one sitting at the very end in my white coat. And rather than talking about the policies that they wanted us to discuss, I took a chance to then tell them about the experience I'd had that morning. And I said, you know what? You asked us all to get a COVID test before we came to visit you. Your policy was that we needed to be COVID tested and negative before we entered. However, it was inaccessible. Had this been a dark and scary, stormy night and I was by myself, I may not have been able to get that COVID test, would never been able to communicate with those inside to say I needed this, and I would have missed this meeting. Now, maybe there's something more important than just a meeting with your friends. Maybe it's a critical intervention. Maybe it's being able to then get to an appointment that's necessary for your health. But if you don't have access to what it is that people are trying to do, you can't get that done. Now, anyone that hasn't heard me tell this story, does anyone know which one of my friends I went to go visit? That was the White House. I was invited last year to go have a conversation about how Biden and Harris administrative policies impacted the state of Michigan, something called building our communities in action, and this was the Michigan one. And I specifically was invited about the disability community. Now, I tell you the story not to say that if even the White House is getting this wrong, then we're all doomed. No, I'm saying that I want people to then approach these conversations with vulnerability and humility. Because every single one of us is still in a process of learning. We're never going to be done learning, but that is, I think, sometimes the problem, that people think they have all the answers. That we've been teaching this way for the past 40 years and it's worked. What is with this newfangled thing that you talk about with accommodations? I'm sure we had disabled students before and they didn't need all this extra help that you're providing them. So I hope that we all can realize that as we are learning more and more about mental health, as we learn more and more about pedagogy and ways that we can teach, that we don't limit the way that we can then provide instructions to students, and we see the fact that people have access needs that may be different. So last thing is a very short video that I will end with that shows a way that I have been given access and an opportunity, and it's just one example of something that we can do. It is not the example, but it's just one. So here's a video that I just want to end with.
I'm lucky that I have my parents. Every successful deaf person I know had parents who advocated for them when they were young and made sure that their kids had a chance. That's really all we need, is a chance to do what we want to do. I never really thought of myself as a trailblazer. I just thought of myself, by the way, this is what I want to do and what do I need to do, and you have to go through all these steps to get to the point where you want to be. In my case, a practicing family doctor. I've heard from, and I'm not exaggerating, probably several hundred people who have told me that it was because of me that they were able to go into medicine. These are people's hearing loss. Michigan has been very good to me in the sense that they've always supported me. They are very accepting of my hearing loss. When I became chair, I was able to recruit several very highly successful young faculty, and they actually proposed focus on providing healthcare clinically, providing healthcare education for students and residents and fellows, and providing healthcare research to improve the healthcare for people with disabilities of all types, not just people with hearing loss. It's been very, very successful. We're talking about people applying to medical school with disabilities. You have to realize these are the cream of the crop. They have gone through a lot more hoops and figured out how to get to where they are that most people haven't had to deal with. That we're not actually lowering standards when we admit them. We probably are raising standards because these are people who are really top notch. I think Michigan is always been a leader in equal opportunities for everybody. The two previous chairs have created a culture here in family medicine. In a way, we're kind of counter culture being here at Michigan, but we also have a very supportive culture where we tolerate people doing different things. We realize people are here not just to only take care of patients, although that's part of it, but they're also here to do research, they're here to teach. One of the things I would love the next chair to do, and I really hope they do, is to continue to support that kind of culture. Because I really think, more than anything, it's not me, it's not the previous chairs, it's the culture that lets the faculty be so successful. It's not one individual, it's the whole group. Am I impressed with myself? I'm satisfied that I feel good. I did what I wanted to do, and in retrospect, I impacted a lot of people positively, not only patients, but also other people with disabilities, and we've opened up a whole new area for Americans and non-Americans who have disabilities to have an equal chance in life and opportunity to bring more diversity and new ideas and new perspectives that would not have happened. I think we have just begun to scratch the surface of people with disabilities and what we can do for them.
So as I asked Dr. Mortensen to come up here, I ended with that because that was the former chair of the Department of Family Medicine who recruited me here. And I end with that because I did not know much about disability prior to my own injury. But it does not take an injury to then see an access need and to act upon it. So something that I tell people is that the past may not be your fault, but what I say is that the future will be. So what is it that we are going to do to make someone's tomorrow better than their yesterday? And each one of you could be that person that is giving someone a chance. That by letting them know that they are still capable and competent and qualified, by letting them know that they can still do whatever it is they need to do, that they are not less than or inadequate, that we destigmatize disability and depression and mental illness, and let them know that that is normalized and that they are not the problem. That there are structures and policies and procedures that we need to improve upon to make sure that people don't look at you as the negative, and that we recognize that we have not done enough to create access for everyone. So thank you for that opportunity, and now I know Dr. Mortensen will have a little chat together, and we'll open it up at the end for some of your questions.
Thank you, Fermi, and thank you for the opportunity to, I guess, share some of what we do when we just talk, and I bring a lot of curiosity to what I feel like is still a pretty emerging area of understanding. So thank you, and you're an inspiration. I have two questions that I thought I would ask Fermi, and then we'll open it up. And One of them is I wanted to share one of the most common questions I'm asked as a psychiatrist and as a college health administrator, which is, if so many college students today struggle with mental health, does that mean everyone is disabled and that everyone needs accommodations? I hear that quite a bit. And it's not an easy or a quick response, because it's not an easy question to answer, and I usually stumble through it. And I usually say it depends. And it depends on three key clinical variables, intensity of the symptoms, frequency, duration. These are things we think a lot about clinically. And it's those variables, as well as the relative strengths and supports and resilience that students have in place, that matter. And each of these variables determine the impact of a condition on their daily functioning. So it's usually something like that. Kind of clumsy, though, when it comes out. And I was curious how you think about this question in your work, as a SAS director specifically, but also more generally as a disability advocate.
No, thank you, Lindsay. This is something that I also grappled with, because as I described the medical model of disability to you all, that is how most of us as physicians, as clinicians, as practitioners, were taught, right? We have ICD-9 and 10 codes, we have the DSM, and we have to diagnose, and then we have to treat, and then the purpose is to then reduce these symptoms, right? But the difficult part is that I myself, now living as a disabled individual, this is where, depending on how fired up I feel on that day, I sometimes tell people, I have probably done more than 98% of many people today, yet I'm the one that is categorized as disabled. Now, I say this to people because disability still carries this four-letter word negative connotation, and that's the reason why people ask questions like this, because they see disability as some scarlet letter that goes on people, but then it confers you some advantage that now you're getting these additional resources. And so I think this is an opportunity to talk about universal design, because if we had a way, if we created a system that made it such that fewer accommodations were needed because there was sufficient flexibility in the pedagogy, then there wouldn't need to be as many accommodations, right? If people realize that students are going to then have something that may disrupt their academic course, and you build that in to the flexibility of your syllabus, I think that we won't have as many people that are worried. But from a clinical standpoint, the diagnoses still need to exist. But from a culture standpoint, we need to recognize that even without a formal diagnosis, there are students that will struggle when they come. And the truth is, if we want to get nitpicky, the ADA does not require that you have a formal diagnosis. If you look even at the wording of the ADA, in order to then get accommodations, it even says the perception of disability. So if you have something that other people perceive as different, as impacting one or more major life functions, then that is a disabling sort of characteristic. And then we and you are protected in being able to get accommodations. So it's a roundabout way of answering the question, because I said earlier, I do think that we are all on this sort of continuum. And there's no clean line where you draw that says, these people are not disabled, these people are disabled. And truthfully, if you look at the definition of disability, many of us, if not all of us, could identify as being disabled. If I didn't have my glasses, I guarantee you some of my major life activities would not go too well if I needed to do them without this access resource. So many people have something that could count as disability, but because of the negative stigma associated with it, we don't describe it in that way. And so it's not a direct answer, because I think it comes from a place where the word itself is the problem and how people perceive the word. And so I don't want to put someone into a box of a word that I think actually needs to be expanded in its definition in the first place. And so yes, many people have access needs, and our role should be to then figure out how we can equitably provide that access.
Reminds me of the mental health continuum model we're really trying to socialize at Michigan, right? That we all are kind of on this continuum at different stages of our life. Mm-hmm. It's not that some people have mental health issues and some people don't. So I really appreciate that characterization. And I think it's a good segue into the next question. You and I chatted recently about a recent New York Times opinion piece that some of the people in the audience may have read. It was by Adam Grant. And the title was, "The SATs will be different this year, and that could be a game changer." And I just want to read the opening 2 paragraphs of that piece, which describes Grant's experience teaching college students at the University of Pennsylvania, or Penn in the Ivy League, and then follow with a question. So here's how the opinion essay opens up. He says, "A few years ago, I started asking lecture halls filled with students at Penn to raise their hands if they had run out of time on the SAT. In each room, nearly every hand went up. I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been. For decades, educators have seen speed as a marker of aptitude or mastery, forcing students to scramble to finish tests. But a race against the clock doesn't measure knowledge or intelligence. It assesses the much narrower skill of how well students reason under stress. As a result, timed tests underestimate the capabilities of countless students." And it's a great essay, and not too long. You should definitely check it out. So, do you see this issue in your work at SAS? And what do you think it means for the experience of college students and higher ed staff and faculty, some of whom are in the audience?
So, as you can probably see, I like to answer questions and stories. And I use this another analogy from my life. So I'm now primarily a wheelchair user. If you asked me to go from outside and get to this stage, and you didn't give me a wheelchair, I could make it here. I would be tired, my clothes would likely be tattered, I would have dragged myself across the floor to get here, but I could have accomplished that task, right? My question to you is that the path that we need all of our students to take? If that is the goal, why should there need to be a barrier to get to that goal? And so I don't even like, even within our work, people talk about extended time. I wish we could, and I haven't said this to my team recently, I wish we could change how we even call it extended time, because that gives the assumption that there is some standard time that is norm. As an academic, I sometimes challenge faculty, and I say, did you do a study to determine the ideal amount of time that your students on average need for this exam, and that is the reason that you've made this a 1-hour exam, or is it because you have a 1-hour time slot for your class? Because if there's no data that says that it takes 1 hour to demonstrate mastery of this subject matter, then that's an arbitrary amount of time that you have chosen. And once again, depending on how saucy I feel, I challenge you as an instructor then to create a way that you can assess your students' capabilities to then demonstrate what you have taught them. Because you taught this information. If they don't have the appropriate mechanism to then demonstrate the knowledge that they have, then you need to then shift the way that you assess it. Because if the goal is just getting from there to here, why should using a wheelchair be seen as a negative? And so whatever that wheelchair equivalent is what I try to then say to people. And I'll even end with another sort of story about this. I just had the fortune of building a house, and everything that I had to do in that house to make it accessible was considered a custom upgrade. So I wanted no cabinet underneath my kitchen sink so I could roll under my kitchen sink. Once again, I wanted fewer cabinets. Tell me why fewer cabinets cost me more money. Because it is not the ableist way that we do things. It was different from the norm. So to be a little saucy with them, I said, you know what, we were talking about ceiling height, and 9, 10-foot ceilings cost more, and that's supposed to look pretty. I was like, you know what, I just want 5-foot ceilings. And they did exactly that and said, well, that's foolish, nobody wants Oh. And I was like, you see there? They said, well, then if anyone comes to visit you that's not a chair user or that's not under 5 feet tall, they're not gonna be able to fit. I said, welcome to how the disability community feels in the rest of the world. If I'm not even allowed to build my own personal home to my specifications, then why should we be allowed to build a public society where individuals with disabilities that have different access needs have to beg for change? I said the standard should be something that everybody can use. The fact that I had to pay for a barrier-free entry to my home with no stairs, I said that should be the standard. Everyone can enter a home with a flat entry. If you want 6 stairs, you should have to pay for the custom upgrade. But this is how ingrained in our society ableism is that we build for what we see the norm to be, and don't recognize the fact that access for our most sort of marginalized, minoritized, and in the most need still creates access for those that don't need it. So, long-winded answer once again, but it is something that I think we have an opportunity to start to shift the way that our society views those things. And time on an exam is not the barometer for competence for the student. And if that's the only way that you can then demonstrate that, I think that we need to challenge ourselves as educators to figure out a different way to do it. And it is not something that shows that the student is less than in any sort of way. So that's absolutely something that we see, and I tip my hat to Kat and the rest of our staff, because they work tirelessly every day to provide that access for our students, and they work with instructors. So this is not an us versus them conversation. It is an interactive process that allows us to say what is a fundamental need in this coursework and what would then be seen as a fundamental alteration. Because we are not required to find access in every space, if that makes sense. There may be certain courses that it would be a fundamental alteration of that course to change something in a way, right? And that is not what we're coming in to force instructors to then change everything fundamentally. But we need to get them to open their minds to think about different ways that they can assess competence, and we just haven't done that as well as we can. And I tell people, if we can figure out how to have, wheelchair-using deaf physicians be physicians and take care of patients, then I think that in academics and in higher education, we can figure out a way to then assess someone's mental capacity on a test that does not require time alone. So I want to give some time for people to ask questions, and I told Dr. Mortensen that if you let me talk, I will talk for too long. So let's leave a little time if anyone wants to come up to one of the microphones and ask a question. Please just come on lining up at the microphones, and people can start asking their questions with the few minutes we have remaining. So if you have a question, we got 2 microphones on either side, and we'll go back and forth.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm curious, as a parent of a child who previously accessed through the services for students with disabilities, it was interesting you brought up the time extension, because actually that sometimes provoked more anxiety, like if you had an extra week to do a paper but you still left it to the last minute. I'm just curious, I feel like it is so challenging to think about accommodations that are supportive for students struggling with mental health concerns, but that also allow them to still be part of the class, and especially if it's a class that's like experiential and they need to be there, staying home for a day is not really helpful. So I'm just curious sort of how you think about that, and what are some of the strategies in those types of situations?
Yes, that's a great question. So that's why we call it an interactive process, and why when I started with saying when you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability, what that individual student's needs may be in order to then effectively get what they need from that course may be different. So for some student, they may need that additional time, and that might be sufficient. But for another student, it might not be that, right? It might be that in order to get this experiential component, we do it in a different setting, right? Or, we have, different sort of protections or safeguards put in place. I'm being nebulous because I don't ever want to answer a question about a specific accommodation without the information that then would determine it. So that process, however, is what Kat and our team are great at doing, is we meet with the student, they get the syllabus, they see what the expectations are, and oftentimes when there is flexibility within like a syllabus statement, we can come up with something that doesn't even require a true accommodation. But when the syllabus is rigid and it doesn't allow a change is when we have to then build in, and then if the instructor says that this feels like a change, there's a back and forth exchange with instructor and coordinator. But there are ways that we can do those things. And I mean, I'll tell you, this is just one example. There was a time where there was a student, for certain reasons, that they couldn't be in person for something that was an art class that they were going to be looking at each other's work. We then ended up having a screen that went around with essentially an avatar. So another student took the screen around, and that other student was in their home, but was able to then zoom in to this sort of art experience. So while they weren't able to physically be there for reasons that I wouldn't disclose, they were still able to participate. But that took us looking at what the actual barrier is, and what is the nexus between the disability and the barrier, and what can we do to then make access in that space. But once again, there may not always be access for every single class, but until we look into what can be done, we don't start with a no. We start with how, and then we interact to then make sure that we can do it as best as possible. And most often, there's something that can be done. So hopefully that helps.
And one thing that just adds, I think, more complexity with mental health, as many of you know, is that co-occurring conditions are kind of the rule in mental health, right? So you can have somebody with ADHD who needs extra time on an exam who also has OCD. They're very commonly co-occurring. And actually sometimes that time, if you get sort of stuck in a compulsive or ritual or an obsessive thought loop, can actually work at cross purposes with the time itself. So it's actually incredibly complex, and more complex than I think for some physical disabilities, not all, to know what is the right or perfect or good enough accommodation.
Thank you for that response, and thank you for such a great talk today. My name is Michelle Mullen, and my master's degree is in like the anti-medical model approach. So psychiatric rehabilitation, if anyone knows what that is. But in my work with young adults, I actually try not to use the word disability or disabled, in that when young adults are growing and thinking about and I focus on mental health conditions, that their mental health condition is a disability and that they are disabled, it creates a certain structure or thought in their mind, and they refer to themselves as mentally ill, which is as a condition, like there's almost no other condition that we refer to as an illness, but as a condition. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about the, in some instances, like really negative impacts and harm of disability, illness, and disabled, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
So, to no surprise to you probably, here's a story. So, I often juxtapose racism and ableism when I have these conversations. And please be reminded that I've said that when you've talked to one person with a disability, you've talked to one person with a disability. So this is not a disagreeing with you, it's just I'll give you some context. So, ableism and racism I juxtapose. There are many people that see the color of my skin as a negative thing. And so some people associate negativity with blackness. And therefore, they would not want to be seen as black, to the degree that we even have entire sort of eras where people talked about passing because you were fair enough that you could pass as not having black, right? We even talk about the one drop rule where people say, well, if you had one drop of black in you, you have to identify as being black. But people sometimes try not to do that because they know about the stigma that's associated with blackness. I see nothing wrong with my blackness. I'm a very proud black African man, and I would fight to then show people that their assumptions of what blackness is the reason why some people would shy away from blackness as a word. My personal belief, and what I have sort of experienced in the past sort of 11 years of having my illness, my disability is very similar. People may shy away from disability, and there's sort of a say the word campaign where people talk about saying disability because it is not a negative thing. But because people view it as a negative thing is the reason why I think that your work is important, because not everyone is going to be at that point in their journey where they're ready to then disclose or accept or identify as disabled. And I also don't even want to make it seem like it's a must, where people must be happy to identify as disabled. But I think that because of that, your work is important and needs to exist so that students, people can find themselves in a space that is not stigmatized. But simultaneously, I think that both models need to be identified to also say that if you do identify as disabled, you can be proud and disabled, right? Because the fact that my legs may not work the way as someone else's, I don't see as a negative. It's just a difference. And I talk to kids all the time about difference when we talk about disability. And we say, look, these are differences that people have. And we look at people and say, look next to you. Is that person the exact same as you? They say, no. I say, anyone have any siblings? Yes. Any twins? I'm a twin. Is your twin the exact same as you? And they're like, no, Susie likes ketchup and I like mustard, right? But we tell them that there's difference even in twins. But it's because someone then tells you that that difference should be seen as less than. When that happens when you're young, you turn into the adult that sees difference as negative. But when we show children diversity of all sorts of ways, sizes, ways of thinking, ways of loving, ways of eating, ways of worshiping, ways of processing, ways of communicating, they don't stigmatize it in the same way. So my 12-year-old son sees wheelchair users now, and the first question that he asks them is, what sport do you play? Because adaptive sports have been my passion, and so all of his life, he has seen Paralympians in wheelchair tennis, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby. So many people are told not to look at the person in a wheelchair, oh, that's rude. But my son is like, well, what sport do you play? Must be, is it basketball? Look at your arms, that's probably rugby, right? So because his bias, his stigma, is that every wheelchair user must be an athlete because that's what he knows. So I would much rather the stigma be on the side of assigning something that is not negative to disability. But once again, long-winded answer, I don't disagree. I think that both things are necessary. I would love to get to a point, however, where it is not a negative word to identify as disabled, right? Similar to special needs. Personally, I don't like the phrase, I know it's necessary. I don't like it because I tell people that the needs of the disability community are not any more special than anyone else's needs. But because they're not getting them is the reason that we have to assign this category to it. The needs are the same, they're just not being met.
Hi, my name is Tracy Gallardo. I am a social worker at CAPS at the Dearborn campus, and I started, I think, 7 months now. I've been in the position, so I'm new to higher education. So a lot of the work that we do, we tend to partner a lot, collaborate with DAS, because of the services that we have for our students who have mental disorders or mental illnesses or even hardships that, make them eligible for accommodations under DAS. However, I think I'm just asking for guidance or recommendation or advice from you when it comes to bringing up those accommodations that some of our students could qualify. How can I phrase it in a way that when I tell them, it doesn't seem as a negative thing, right? Because we talk about stigma, what comes when you hear the word disability, because it sounds like even when I bring it up, they tend to say, well, I don't think it's fair that I qualify for extra time, right? Or accommodations for my schoolwork while my peers don't. And having them understand that, it's not that it's unfair, it's that, you just need additional support to succeed or to be able to, meet your goals and stuff. And I notice that I get resistance back from students when I bring it up. And I think I'm just trying to figure out how is it that I, as a clinician, could bring it up so that, when they hear it, kind of going back to what you mentioned, it being of a positive thing versus it being negative.
So I will try to answer briefly. It's a multifaceted answer, right? Because it takes stakeholders at different stages of that experience to then reinforce this. Because if you have, just to be direct, if you have a family unit that has tried to then not acknowledge your disability because they just want to push through, it may be really difficult for you as a student to then get to higher education and then say, I'm going to ask for help because I was sort of raised to not. I was raised to kind of just do my best and push through it. Then if you have instructors or a teacher that then makes you feel as though your access or accommodation is extra and it is like a leg up as opposed to your peers that don't have it, that's difficult as well. And then within your peer group, if you see all of your peer group that are doing these things without accommodations, you may feel like, what's wrong with me that I can't do it, right? So multiple sort of spaces. But one of the things I would just say to people, and I do say very directly, is once again in analogies. I wear glasses. I think that glasses are somewhat universally understood. If you don't wear glasses, and I give you my glasses to take a test, you will probably do worse, right? So if you don't need glasses, there should be no reason why you are critical of someone who does need glasses wearing them. And when I tell people that mental health is even so much more intricate and complex, physical disability, like low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, I think it's easier for people to understand access for that as opposed to access for a mental health diagnosis. But at least if I try to juxtapose that to something like that, I say you may not understand why, right? But I hope that you get to a point where you at least respect the fact that people have different access needs. So you, if I'm talking to you as the student that has this, I say, look, there's nothing wrong with you. You just have a different access need than your peer does. And so if it's time or a limited distraction environment or screen reader technology or a scribe or a reader, whatever it may be, your peer doesn't need that for access. Now, something else we talk about is accommodations do not give you success. Accommodations provide you with the access to increase the likelihood of you being able to demonstrate your success. But it's very hard to be successful without access in the first place. And a lot of students have been successful without accommodations, and that's the analogy of me crawling my way up to this stage. But that should not have been the journey I've had to take. And so providing that access, and if you can walk up these stairs to get to the auditorium stage, that's fine. But I shouldn't be forced to walk up the stairs if we can put a ramp there. And so that's the difference. And if you want to use the ramp, that's fine, but that's universal design type of conversation. If we create access in a way that everyone can use it, that's fine. But what happens too often is then we create universal access, and then people think that now they don't need accommodations anymore. But there will still be barriers for individuals that exist even with some of the universal design we provide. And this is my best attempt at a short answer.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I think we're over time, but maybe one quick, yeah?
I can just come up afterwards also, if that's okay.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we're 7 minutes over. I said a little bit, but it's,
Yeah.
I think it's a lot. Thank you, Fermi. Please join me in thank you, Dr. O. And Dr. Sevig is going to close out the conference today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Well, what a wonderful way to end our conference. Just a few minutes to close us out here. For those of you who weren't at the beginning of the conference, my name is Todd Sevig, and I'm director of the Student Counseling Center, now part of University Health and Counseling here on campus. And I'm also a co-chair and part of the planning committee. And I had the honor to start us off yesterday and the double honor, I guess, to end us today. So just a few comments. Just a friendly reminder to complete the conference evaluation. It is linked to CEUs for you, but we actually use this information a lot throughout the year to plan for our future, including our conference next year. So thank you so much to everyone who has joined together these last 2 days, yesterday and today. Our planning staff, the presenters, those of us in attendance, those of us who have been here for all 20 conferences over the years, or those of us who are here for the first time. The issues that we've covered are many and represent greater knowledge, energy, and sophistication than 20 years ago, and at times may not feel any less challenging or complex. But the power of coming together to confront these issues is always greater than the challenges, and that will always win out. And I think we did this here yesterday and today. I hope you feel inspired and encouraged and are already looking forward to next year's event and have specific ideas that you can implement on your campus. So thank you. Thank you for coming, for participating, for engaging and contributing. And I think most importantly, as you leave and arrive back home, whether it's here on campus or afar, please use your voice. Your literal voice, your conceptual voice, your loud voice, your angry voice, your compassionate voice, your quiet voice, your voice filled with tears as a loved one experiences a mental health issue, your voice filled with joy when treatment is working and helping, your voice which once was silenced, yet now flourishes, and your voice filled with wisdom. And if at times you don't have energy to have a voice, find someone who does and join together. And again, I think that's what we did here today, because our collective needs all of our voices. And in fact, is defined by all of our voices working together. So thank you so much for everything, and safe travels. Thanks.